Yes, indeedy, folks. It's the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo of trails and roads and rails. Idaho's unique link through the city of rocks. When we last visited trails, roads, and rails, we saw that between 1843 and the early 1860s, there was no reason to stop in southern Idaho when the emigrants were passing through on the Oregon and California trails. However, in the mid-1860s, gold was discovered in southern Idaho, and suddenly there was a reason for heavy freight wagons to be coming in from California through Winnemucca. Miners poured into the area, and it wasn't long before there was a need for fast mail and passenger service. These were provided by stage companies. While southern Idaho was growing from the discovery of gold, the area around the north end of the Great Salt Lake was growing because of the settlement of Mormons. Several stage routes were opened up to serve this population, including a branch out in the middle of the desert that headed up into eastern Idaho. By April of 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad had reached this little junction in these stage roads. Suddenly, it was much easier to ship heavy freight for central and eastern Idaho into this little junction of the roads. And this little junction in the road became known as Kelton. A very rapid little tent city grew up. And that city would become a boom town once the Transcontinental Railroad was completed over the Promontory Mountains. The man responsible for turning a tent city into a boom town was John Haley, whom Haley, Idaho is named after. John Haley immediately established a stage line between Boise and Kelton. It was the quickest way for anybody in Boise or south central Idaho to get to the east. John Haley purposely sent his stages through the City of Rocks. The difference between going through the City of Rocks and Albion was about the same distance. It was a little more difficult, but John Haley wanted people to see the magnificence of the City of Rocks. The stage line was 240 miles long. Nowhere on the entire route was it smooth. There were some areas that were smoother than others, but it was rough going on dirt roads with washboards and ruts, dust and or mud the entire way. These stages did have to slow down when they crossed the Snake River on a ferry, and there were several cuts into mountainsides that got the stages over the cliffs of southern Idaho. One of the most spectacular and obvious of these cuts is the Kelton Ramp. Cut into the cliffs just east of Boise, the Kelton Ramp was a rough surface that was squeezed between a solid cliff on one side and a drop-off on the other. Obviously, up such a narrow and difficult and rocky section of the road, the driver would take the coach very slowly. One, you don't want to break the horse's legs. Secondly, you don't want to tear the coach apart. And thirdly, you don't want to be thrown off the edge. The only thing more difficult than going up would be going down. Despite having to slow down for the ferry and having to slow down in such difficult areas as the Kelton Ramp, The Boise-Kelton stage covered 240 miles in 40 hours. 40 hours. Just under 2 days. Wagon trains considered 15 miles a day a good day. To make 240 miles in 40 hours, the 6 or 4 horse teams on a stagecoach were kept running as hard as they could all the time. Averaging 6 miles an hour and figuring in the stops to eat and to change horses, and the difficult times getting up cliffs and the slow times on ferries. Most of the times, the horses must have been running over 10 or more miles an hour, pushing on through the night, using moonlight or lanterns and the memory of the horses and the wagon masters to get them through. Stagecoaches were the winged chariots of their day, flying past the emigrants and the freight wagons that were crawling across this country. Can you imagine it, folks? Can you imagine riding one of those stages? Now, they did have a suspension of sort. The common way to do that was to have heavy leather straps underneath the stage so that the wheels were somewhat separated from the box you were riding in. But still, that box was being shooken around all the time. There was never a moment that you weren't being shook up and down and back and forth and thrown from side to side. It just went on and on and on. The only time it stopped was when you stopped at a stage station to change horses. The only time it stopped is when you stopped to eat. The only time you got a rest was when you were on the ferry crossing the Snake River. For 40 hours, you simply were in the dust and being shook to death. It must have been just amazing. I can't imagine. It seems to me like I would have just gotten out and walked. But, of course, walking takes a lot longer than 40 hours. When I ride in my car out on the desert and think about those pioneers going 240 miles in 40 hours, it just stuns me to think what they went through. I know I was once in Dusseldorf, and I got on an airplane in the morning, and that night at 10 o'clock, I was in Boise. From Dusseldorf, Germany, to Boise in a day. These people, for just under 2 days, were being shaken around inside a stage in order to go to Salt Lake, to the lake, not to the city, to the far north end of the lake. Oh, but I had to sit in this little chair, and there wasn't very much leg room, and they served me a meal or two, but they were airline food. It wasn't very good. And I had to go through customs, and they gave me a warm towel in the morning to wipe my face, and the things we whine about these days. Next time you think you're uncomfortable on a road trip, just think about taking a stage for 40 hours. Of course, no horse, whether there be 4 of them or 6 of them, can possibly run for 40 hours. And especially not pulling a heavy stage. The limit of a horse to run is why there was a stage station built every 10 miles. The people at the stage station had a pretty good idea when the stage would be showing up, and they would have a full set of horses on their doubletrees with reins, all ready to go. The stage would pull in and stop. The station master would take the reins from the driver, reach between the horses and the stage, and remove the one pin that held the horses to the stage and lead off the weary horses. The fresh horses were backed up to the stage, the pin was dropped so the horses were connected, the reins were handed to the driver, and once again, after the very briefest of pauses, the stage was running as fast as horses could pull it. Every once in a while, one of the stage stops would serve a meal. You had time to get off, eat, go out and water the bush if you needed to, and be back on the stage. There were also stage stops with beds for the drivers, so that one driver could get off and sleep until another stage came for him to drive, and the stage that he had been driving would be taken over by another driver, and he would keep that stage on the road. If a passenger had the time, or if they simply could not go on right now, they could, for a small fee, rent one of the beds, spend the night, and catch tomorrow's stage. On the Boise-Kelton run, one of the stage stops that was truly looked forward to, thanks to Mr. Haley, was the City of Rocks stop, properly known as the City of Rocks Home Station. This station was very popular not only with the stage drivers and the passengers. It was a favorite stopping spot for whatever settlers were still coming by wagon and by the few people that were bringing supplies with heavy freight wagons. The station was made popular by the beautiful City of Rocks that so many people were looking forward to seeing. But it was the station master and his wife that made this station so popular in the hearts and memories of many people who experienced it. Mr. and Mrs. William Trotter ran the station, and while the food was complained about at many stations, they always raved about the food that Mrs. Trotter supplied. A typical touch was Christmas of 1876. The wagon masters and the stage drivers found that Mr. Trotter had put up a Christmas tree and decorated it with popcorn and with cranberries. One stage driver commented that the special Christmas dinner was a feast that only youth and vigor could do justice to. And hanging from the boughs of the trees were special mementos for every driver, every wagon master, everyone who stopped by the station on a regular basis. These stage stations are why the stagecoach was the fastest means of transportation, even faster than galloping your own horse. Yes, it's true. Your horse would have to be a pretty old nag to not be able to run faster than these 4 or 6 horse teams pulling a heavy coach. However, no horse can run for 40 hours. Basically, what the stagecoaches did was set up a relay race where the coach was the baton that was passed from team to team. This race was divided into stages between the different relay houses. Hence the name, the stagecoach. In the West, the only faster way to travel was indeed galloping horses that were set up so that they could be changed all across the West. It was called the Pony Express. And what, pray tell, would a person pay to have their body thrown all around a box for 40 hours? The Northwestern Stage Company advertised a great rate reduction on the fare to the east. Boise City to Kelton, Utah was now only $50. There was a lot of gold in southern Idaho at the time, and I have seen where prices were pretty high. Even so, I would not be surprised but what that $50 represented more currency than what I paid to fly from Dusseldorf to Boise. Today we romanticize about these difficult and perilous journeys. However, by 1881, romantic or not, their days were numbered. In 1881, some railroaders got together and organized the Oregon Short Line Company to build a railroad across southern Idaho. The crews had lots of experience, having built the Transcontinental Railroad and several other major lines in the West. Construction began where the Transcontinental Railroad passed at Granger, Wyoming. By 1883, the train had reached Shoshone. At the time, Shoshone was nothing more than where the railroad intercepted the dirt road etched across the desert going up to Ketchum. A new stage terminal was established in Shoshone for traffic to Boise. By the end of that summer, the rail line had reached a small watering hole on Indian Creek. They named this place Owyhee, and a couple months later, it was renamed Kuna. Of course, the city fathers in Boise were disappointed that the railroad was going to Indian Creek and not up through Boise. However, Indian Creek was only 15 miles from Boise, 15, not 240. Even before the rail reached the Indian Creek location, there were people setting up a stage company to run the 15 miles between Boise and Kuna. Even with this new rail line and this new faster service to Boise, the old stage line through the City of Rocks and to Albion and to Kelton was maintained for local mail and some local delivery of goods. But the stage companies soon realized that you could not keep a dead horse alive. On October 6th, 1883, all the stages and the drivers were brought to Boise and assigned to other routes. The Kelton-Boise stage that had served this area for 14 years faded into memory. And Kelton, the little town that started merely as a juncture in the road out on the marshes of the far end of the Great Salt Lake, this improbable town that was thrown into creation, starting with tents and very quickly, within months, putting up permanent buildings, when the railroad reached the point 20 miles to the west of the Promontory Mountains. This spot, where if you sank wells, you merely got salt, so the water had to be piped in by a wooden pipe from up in Idaho. This town that grew to a population of 700, serving the wagons and the stages that were feeding the goods and the people into southern Idaho. Kelton hung on. Kelton hung on as a small ranching community, a place where cattle drives and sheep drives would load livestock onto the railroad, a town that served the needs of the subsistence farmers of the vast surrounding deserts. When the railroad was first built, and ever since it was built, one of the major dreams of the railroad companies was to avoid the Promontory Mountains. Going over these mountains required a 700-foot climb in 11 miles going over Promontory, and another 500-foot climb in 5.5 miles over the Hogback Mountains near Kelton. It had long been considered the major bottleneck in getting traffic across the nation. Despite many people who didn't think it could be done, by the early 20th century, the railroad and its engineers thought that they could put a causeway across the Great Salt Lake and avoid the promontories. The undertaking would require 103 miles of new track. 25 miles of that would be crossing the lake. Of that, there would be 13 miles of fill in the shallow parts and another 12 miles of trestle crossing the deepest parts of the lake. The cutoff was built with $8 million, with 3,000 men. The piles took a 2-square-mile forest that had to be brought in from Oregon, and the monumental undertaking was finished in just under 2 years. The new line was put into service March 8th, 1904. Although this new route was only 12 miles shorter than the old route over the Promontory Mountains, it was deemed the Lucin Cutoff because, indeed, it cut off the terrible bottleneck of going over the mountains. By January of 1905, the railroad had seen a major increase in traffic because of this shorter route. Even with this increase in traffic, it took $61,000 less to maintain the Lucin Cutoff than it took to maintain the road over Promontory in January of 1904. Of course, the railroad immediately abandoned its line over the Promontory Mountains. The railroad did maintain a spur to Kelton until 1939, and Kelton remained a shipping center and farming center. In 1939, the railroad abandoned Kelton as not a profitable route. Just like the stage and wagon lines that had given it its birth, Kelton faded into history. In 1942, the tracks across Promontory Point and through Kelton to Lucin were torn up and melted down for the war effort. Today, you can recognize Kelton as an abandoned foundation and the ghost of one of the world's most historic railroads.
There was a lady once, I read this story, and as I remember, I'm pretty sure it was the Jerome exit. If not, it was one close enough to this so that it makes a great Southern Idaho true story. This lady was a mail-order bride. Mail-order brides were very much like today. We have the internet. We get together if we're lonely with somebody and we go say hi to them. Well, in those days, of course, it was mail. It took a long time, and you kind of committed yourself to going to say hi to somebody. This lady was probably not from a desert climate. She was from where it was green and lush. Chances are she was coming from back in the Midwest or in the East. Well, she got out to Jerome, Idaho. This gentleman had been talking with her, and she decided, well, you know, I think this is going to work out, and I'm going to commit myself to it. So she went out, and she got off the train in this spot where there was not a building, there was not anything. There wasn't a tree. There wasn't a stream. There was nothing except this dirt trail crossing the railroad. And there was also no gentleman this man that she had come to see was not there. Well, the conductor asked, "Are you sure that you want to stay? You can buy a ticket and go on into a town." And she said, No, I'm convinced that he will be here. And so she sat down on her trunk and she watched the train disappear into the distance. It got smaller and smaller until you not only could no longer hear it, you could no longer see it. And there she sat on her trunk for an hour, maybe two. It was a long time, with nothing but the wind and the smell of sagebrush and the heat. She must have been wondering, what on earth am I doing? Of course, there was not going to be another train, for at least for a day, and probably for 2 or 3. So she sat until she saw a little dust off in the distance. And as the little time passed, the dust she could see was being made by a buckboard. And she could see that the buckboard had one driver, and that was all. Finally, the buckboard got to where she was sitting at the railroad tracks, and the gentleman asked her if she was Mary, or whatever her name was, and she replied yes, and asked if he was John, whatever his name was, and he replied yes. And so he put her trunk on the buckboard, and they rode out through more desert, through more dirt road, until finally they reached his ranch. I don't know if his ranch was a place where there was some water or if he was just out in the middle of nowhere. I don't really know. But I can just imagine what was going on in her mind. And we have to remember, she had never met this man. She was out there all by herself. Well, as I remember, it worked out. She came to think he was an okay guy, and he came to think that he was the kind of woman that he was looking for. And they were married and spent the rest of their lives out there in that God-forsaken country.
And that's another beer drinker's guide to the Great Wahoo. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you next week. And in the meantime, keep celebrating the Great Wahoo.